Good evening and welcome. Welcome to tonight's Tegeder Talk. My name is Jean Cornish, and tonight we have a fun guest, Jeff Korgen, who has been working on the canonization cause for Dorothy Day, and we'll be talking about that. Jeff is a Louisiana native, went to Boston College, that fine Jesuit school. Is that better? Sorry, thank you. Thanks, Mary. And got a bachelor's degree in philosophy and master's degrees in pastoral ministry and an MSW, and then has a fun connection to the Twin Cities, came to St. Mary's in Winona, and got a graduate certificate in canon law. I think that's right. So some fun connections there. Jeff has spent 23 years working in Catholic social ministry, working with a variety of agencies, including Catholic Relief Service, the Dorothy Day Guild, the Green Faith, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and then after doing that for all those years, formed his own consulting firm looking at how to engage Catholics in social responsibility. Let's see, what else am I missing? There's more. Oh, he has published 4 books. Tonight his topic is the book on Dorothy Day, which will be available for sale at the end. And one other fun thing is Jeff has a friend, a long-term friend, who is joining us tonight, Anne Clement, who is, Jeff says, the leading authority on Dorothy Day. So if you want to kind of catch Anne during Q&A or something afterwards, you can also get her to answer fun questions or provide. So there's Anne here. And I think with that, we can jump in, Jeff. And then, as I say, we'll have just a minute or two break. Think of your questions. At the end, when you have questions, I'll bring the microphone around.
Okay, thanks so much. And is my lapel mic working? Can you hear me from the lapel mic? Thumbs up? Okay. Thanks so much for being here. We got old friends and new here. My father grew up in Duluth, so we've been to Minnesota many times, and I was so thrilled when I found out that the Catholic Church in Minnesota has one of the best social action efforts in the Catholic Church, and Adam Fitzpatrick is here from the what do you call it, mission office now? Social mission office. Okay, thank you so much for being here tonight, Adam. And we're here to talk about Dorothy Day, and I thought, maybe we could start out just, who is Dorothy Day to you? When you hear that word, what do you think of?
Strong, smart, radical woman who did things.
Strong, smart, radical woman who did things. Good. Others? Yeah, no one said, she was a communist. Anybody else? Who is Dorothy Day to you?
Food service.
Food, serving the poor. Like today's gospel reading, right? I was hungry and you gave me food, right? So you're going on the good place, not the bad place with the ones who didn't.
She was also worked so hard for nonviolence.
She worked so hard for nonviolence.
She did the charity with the hospitality houses, but she really worked to end war. She protested a lot. I believe she was arrested. Which war?
Yeah, all of them, including World War II. And we'll talk a little bit about the Star Trek episode that's based on that. There's that's her. Edith Keeler must die. Yeah. We'll get to that. That's a fun stuff. Yeah, okay. So, really complex person who lived a 20th century life. She was born in 1897 and died in 1980. So it's a very 20th century life. Protested pretty much every war the United States was in. But we're going to start where I happen to place the beginning of the Dorothy Day that we know. Different historians start the story in different places. I started with the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. So Dorothy Day, father, was the most prominent sports journalist in the most popular sport in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. Anyone know what that sport was? Nope. Everyone always guessed baseball. You're close. Boxing? No. Another close one. Not cricket. Not cricket. Anybody else? horse racing. And now you remember, oh yeah, Seabiscuit and all that, yeah. That horse racing was the most popular sport in America at that time, beginning of the 20th century, and John Day was the most prominent horse racing authority. And he worked for, I think, the San Francisco Examiner, which was one of the big papers at the time, and he lived in Oakland with his family. The first sign of trouble was in San Francisco when the cathedral bells started ringing at 5:12 in the morning. And the residents of Chinatown were dumbstruck because the cathedral was in Chinatown at the time. It's moved now, but the old cathedral is still there. The bells were ringing. They said, what's going on? Then the earth opened up. And then everything caught on fire. And the whole city burned down. Lots of refugees. And they came over on boats to Oakland, where Dorothy Day and her family lived. Now, they experienced the earthquake too. The parents were awakened, 5 in the morning. Father says, earthquake, I'll get the boys. Mom says, I'll get the baby. They get outside, they say, where's Dorothy? She's inside the house. She experienced the earthquake as someone who is left behind. And so when we think of a person who devoted their life to helping people left behind by our society, do you think it might have anything to do with being left behind? So that trauma is a very important part of Dorothy's life, but it was more than trauma, it was also the inspiration of the relief efforts. There was no big government response to the San Francisco earthquake. It was unions and churches. We sometimes call them mediating institutions. We have a lot of big government, big business, and a lot of little people. What can they do? Well, churches and unions, voluntary associations. And that's what Dorothy Day saw, people coming to help. And in this picture, we actually have all the corporal works of mercy happening at the same time. Because you think about the thing, like burying the dead, clothing the naked, all those things, they were happening in this relief. So she saw them, and there's a very well-reported and well-documented statement that she made to her mother, a question. She asked, Mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time? That's the beginning of the Dorothy Day that we know. So we do, in the book, we do a time jump to 1916, where Dorothy arrives in New York City determined to be a journalist like her father and like her brothers, but on behalf of the people. And her father tells her, newspapers, no place for a girl. It's very unusual. That's why we call this chapter, Dorothy Day, girl reporter, because it was such an unusual thing. And her father said, newspapers, no place for a girl. So she gets to New York, and she is determined to be a reporter. She goes to the major newspapers to interview, and they all say the same thing. Newspapers, no place for a girl. Now remember, her father's one of the most prominent sports journalists in the United States. She began to suspect he might have called these editors because they all said exactly the same thing. Tell her, you can just imagine it. But he didn't call the editors of the socialist papers. And Dorothy talks her way into a job at the New York Call, which is one of the, you might say, one of the middle-of-the-road radical socialist papers. They're very involved in unions and so forth. And her role in that is to get to know ordinary working people and their own struggles and report on that. And here she's interviewing an Italian woman whose husband is a laborer. And she asks, Ms. Salvatore, you say your family eats dog food to get by? And she says, I used to cook up chicken feet for the dog, but now we have to eat them ourselves. We have 6 children. It's not so bad if you cut the nails off and boil them for a long time. And that becomes the article. This is all kind of a swirl of different articles she wrote for the New York Call. And if you're interested, there's a book called An Eye for Others, which you can order from Amazon right now if you want to, which is a collection of all of the articles where there's like a 90% certainty or more that Dorothy Day wrote it. Sometimes it's her bylines right on it. That's easy, 100%. But sometimes there's articles that are in her style, and maybe she wrote at another time about having done that research. So that comes up. And the headline for this is, Mr. J.D. Rockefeller, 26 Broadway. Here's a family living on dog food. And you see that muckraking style. This is the time of Upton Sinclair and the other muckraking journalists of really going for the gut. And Dorothy Day is at the center of all that. She gets a really, really exciting and fun friend group out of this. And they're very diverse. It's interesting to me, all of these radical critics of capitalism, some of them were anarchists for almost no government at all, and some of them were socialists who became communists, where government does everything, but yet they were all in the same newspaper because they had the same criticism. So Dorothy had a very interesting friend group, but unfortunately there was another reporter named Lewis who was a little, you might say probably mentally ill. Dorothy's best friend in this group said that Lewis is as cuckoo as a boiled owl. And I don't know really what that means, but I kind of get the gist. So she has a mentally ill colleague who's always pursuing her for dates, and she keeps saying no to him. And he approaches her at a dance. They used to have these dances to raise bail money for people who had been arrested for their beliefs, especially as World War I came on and it became illegal to criticize the war in print. Think about that when you're thinking about how bad things are getting. That maybe it's a cautionary tale of what's to come, or maybe we should stop crying about how terrible it is and think about how really terrible it was 100 years ago. Dorothy hits him, slaps him, knocks his glasses off. This is before she became an apostle of nonviolence, by the way. Knocks his glasses off, and the next day, her boss says, "You have to apologize to Lewis for hitting him." And she said, "He's the one always pestering me for dates. I keep telling him no, and he keeps, well, you have to apologize." He says, "No, I'm not going to apologize to him." Today, we call that sexual harassment in the workplace. Back then, it was, you have to apologize to Lewis or you're fired. So she talks to her friends about this, and one of her friends, interesting enough, I live like 20 minutes from her house in Provincetown, Massachusetts, Mary Heaton Vorse, who was a real important American writer who was also involved with radical folks. She gave Eugene O'Neill and the Provincetown Players permission to use a big property she had in Provincetown, and what a character. But she tells Dorothy, "Look, Dorothy, stop fighting this. Just come to work for me at the Masses." And the Masses is a more prestigious magazine. This is the magazine that Jack Reed, who, if you remember, Best Picture 1980 or 1981, Reds, that's the Masses. That's the magazine that Dorothy ends up working at. So it's really a promotion. And her editor, she becomes an editorial assistant. She works on book reviews. You can actually read these if you get a chance to look at online issues of the Masses. She becomes, really happy working with them. But the editor says, "Look, we've opposed World War I for a while, or the Great War. We've opposed it for a while. We're all going to get arrested. But you're young, you're a woman. We think they're not going to arrest you. Could you put the last issue of the paper out, the last issue of the magazine out, if we all get arrested?" And she says, "Sure, but you got to teach me." So he brings her to the printers, and she learns how to do that. And she ends up putting out the issue when they all get arrested. Max Eastman and the rest. And interestingly, there's a poem of hers in that last issue. And part of me wonders, did she, kind of stick that in at the last minute, or was it planned to be there? It's like, hey, I'm taking all this risk. I'm going to get my poem in there. And that's the poem, which you can read in the book. And this is just a montage of things that were happening at the time, and the cover of the last issue. So she now is unemployed. And she gets a little bit of stringing, newspaper stringing jobs where she writes an article here or there. But a friend of hers says, "Hey, Dorothy, I'm going down to Washington to protest for women's suffrage. You want to come with me?" She was like, "Sure, I got nothing better to do." You know, when you think about it, like many of us went to our first march or second march because a friend was going and we just tagged along. That's how she ended up in this famous suffragette rally where they ended up, you know, she ends up getting beaten up by a sailor and then later beaten up by police. And she ultimately goes on a hunger strike with the others, along with a lot of people who became kind of famous, including Margaret Sanger's sister, and who almost died in the hunger strike. And Dorothy turns to the Psalms during this arrest, which was, you know, for her, she was kind of, you might call her spiritual, but not religious today. The word back then, you know, I don't know what they called it back then. But she, you know, she never voted. So, you know, it's interesting this always gets brought up as part of her radical past. She even then, she said, women are going to vote for war just as much as men. You know, it never really was her issue. But it happened, and it was a big formative part of her life because of how much suffering that went through. She becomes friends with Eugene O'Neill during this time. It's interesting to me when I do the university presentations of this, no one other than the faculty has ever heard of Eugene O'Neill. So it's quite interesting because usually the church groups, people are like, oh yeah, Eugene, I remember him. He, in this scene, when Dorothy first meets him, he's reciting The Hound of Heaven, which, if you remember it or not, is a poem where someone is pursued by God in the form of this big dog. And Eugene O'Neill claims to be an atheist who is pursued by God. I mean, you figure this out. I mean, one of the things about following Dorothy's life is there sure are a lot of atheists who talk about God a lot. You know, it's just interesting to me. They become friends, and very special friends in a way, because she's the only woman who turns him down when he says, you want to sleep together. And so it kind of startles him, and then he has a relationship with her that's unlike any relationship with a woman he ever had. So they become good friends and go for long walks, and Dorothy tells him about, in the Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima, who is a character who is approached by a wealthy woman who says she's lost her faith. And how can she get her belief in God back? And Father Zosima says, by a life of service. But remember that love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing. It's not like love in dreams. Like he's saying, basically, it's not all rainbows and unicorns when you help people. And Dorothy learns this, you know, when she puts that in action. And she always comes back to this in Dostoevsky. She was fond, she quoted Dostoevsky as much as anybody. And that's one of her unique contributions to the spiritual conversation, is to bring in literature as well as scripture, as well as social teaching. So that's an important part of her life. But then another trauma happens that really sends her on a tailspin, which is at this bar called the Hellhole. They are, you know, all together again, and one of Eugene O'Neill's high school classmates ODs on heroin. He drinks a vial of heroin because his girlfriend dumped him that day. You know, kind of extreme reaction, but it's what happens. And Dorothy holds the guy as he dies in her arms. Everybody in the bar leaves except for this fellow's sister. They go running. Now think about that. All these people that she talked about building a better world, and art and literature and staying up late drinking and going for long walks talking about life. When one of their own dies, they all run. She says, these aren't the people I want to be hanging out with. She eventually reconciled with Gene. Because think about it, Gene, this guy you went to high school with. I mean, can you imagine? Like, think of people from your high school life. If they died right in front of you, you go running. So we moved to like a blue palette for a while. She becomes a nurse during that other pandemic. She wants to have love in action, and she falls in love with a charismatic newspaper man named Lionel Moyse, who claims he was the, I think he was editor or assistant editor. Do you remember, Ann? Lionel, was he editor of the Kansas City Star or the assistant editor? Yeah, it's almost like a trivia question, but he supervised Ernest Hemingway, who was 18 at the time. And he claims to have taught Hemingway how to write. And, he's a big talker and everything, but Lionel's style is very similar to Hemingway's style, and he was older, so you can see how he might have gotten that thought in his head. Dorothy and Lionel fall in love, and Dorothy becomes pregnant. And Lionel says, it's either me or the baby. You have to make a choice. He's not the first or the last guy to say that to somebody. She decides to have the abortion. Emma Goldman, if you remember her, the great anarchist, her boyfriend performs the abortion. And Lionel's supposed to meet her at the end, but he's not even there. Now, I always tell, when I talk to young people, I tell them, be careful, if you're ever dating somebody who's a really good writer, be really careful not to do them wrong, because they will write a revenge novel. Dorothy writes The 11th Virgin as a way of healing herself. And this is a quote, "It's physically impossible for a woman to take a man. She always gives herself up. And now I hate you. I don't want you because I feel everything going out of me to you. The thought of you eats into me continually." Imagine being the guy that's written about. The New York Times actually reviews this book, and they call it an adolescent novel. They say it's not that good, but it sells well. The people like that, It's a powerful love story. And Dorothy gets offered $2,500 from Hollywood to make a silent movie out of her book. Imagine that. And her friends, the movie ultimately is lost, but the people who were alive who saw it during, the 50s or 60s, they said it had nothing to do with the book. So, those Hollywood habits are like that. And so Dorothy gets $2,500, and her friend, the same friend who invited her to Washington for the rally, she says, "Dorothy, everybody knows this, you're terrible with money. Buy a house. You'll have that forever." So she buys a cottage on Staten Island, back when Staten Island looked like Cape Cod, really. And she, there's no garbage dump in New Jersey over there. It's really pristine. And she falls in love with a young anarchist named Foster Batterham. It's spelled Forster, so a lot of people say Forster, but all the people from Dorothy's family say Foster. And that's their grandpa, so figured that's his name. We do a triptych like this for Dorothy falling in love with Lionel, with like three pictures, and Lionel is constantly talking. And this was different for Dorothy because here's a man who's in love with her, who they have shared experiences. And he's not talking all the time. He's a quiet guy, real smart, bookish, but he's not dominating the conversation. And I love that panel on the right. I wrote the script, but Christopher's the artist, and he did such a nice job with that, and also the wave on that. She becomes pregnant again. And this time, she says, I didn't think I'd ever have children again. She had terrible complications from the abortion. She said, I'm never going to have children. And she does. And she feels so grateful to God. And she's had this spiritual awakening for a long time. She was one of these sort of not sure if there's a God or not, but she's constantly thinking about it. The joke at the masses, Art Young, who was the editorial cartoonist, he said that Dorothy Day would make a terrible communist because she was always talking about God. She's always cornering you a party and wanting to have a conversation about God. So Dorothy says, I want to join a church, and I want to join the Catholic Church because it's the church of the poor. And I'm going to have Tamar baptized, and I'm going to get baptized. And by the way, Foster, we can't continue to live together like this. We have to get married. And Foster says, it's against my principles. And, the great book that Kate Hennessy wrote, whose granddaughter, she says the two of them were just so bullheaded that they just couldn't work this out. They couldn't figure out a compromise, even though they're desperately in love with each other. So they break up, and, if you read just Dorothy's versions of this, it's a little too clean. It almost suggests like they never saw each other again. But Foster was an involved parent, and in the sense of sending support and being there for important events. I mean, it's sort of like a co-parenting relationship where Dorothy had custody. and Forster came and was involved to some degree. So we do a time jump then to 1932, and this is a very famous march organized by communists called the Hunger March of 1932. And all these people, including veterans of World War I, who were beginning to starve. I mean, this is 1932, Depression's in full swing, and they come to D.C. and protest. And Dorothy's reaction, at this point, she's been Catholic for 5 years. She doesn't have any Catholic friends. Everybody just comes to Mass and goes home. Imagine that. How things have improved. And then also, she never hears homilies about social justice. Can you believe that? So she's like, what am I doing here? And she looks at this march and says, this is great, but this is the communists doing this. Where are the Catholics? Why aren't we doing, she knows the scriptures. She knows Matthew 25, today's gospel. What were they preaching about in her parish when that came up in the lectionary? I don't know. But it wasn't about workers and people living in poverty. So she is very frustrated at this point. So she goes for a long walk throughout D.C. and ends up at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is under construction. That's why there's all that scaffolding. But they had made the crypt church. So she goes down and prays. And she has a vocational prayer. She prays, you can't probably read the words here, but it says, "Here I am, Lord. Help me to learn how to use the gifts you gave me for my fellow workers and the poor." So it's a vocational prayer. It's here I am, Lord. And I always, in the crowd, I always see people nodding as if they've had that moment too. Like, hey, this is what I'm good at, but I can't seem to put it in practice in a way to build a better world and to build the kingdom of God. And so she says that prayer, she gets on a bus, she writes one last breakup letter to Foster. She gets home, and there's this strange Frenchman there named Peter Morin. She's been praying for a way to use her gifts. And there's this guy there who's a little nutty, there he is in the right panel. He's trying to indoctrinate the doctor who's treating Tamar for the measles. He's trying to indoctrinate him into his movement. But, that is why we must fire the bosses. And same thing with Dorothy. He just comes up and says, several people have told us that we should start a movement together. So let's do it. I will be your teacher. Can you imagine how condescending? But he says something that hits her to the core. Like he's annoying, but he says, you know a lot of the scriptures, but you don't know much about the saints. You don't know much about church teaching of the popes. I will be your teacher. And she realizes she needs a teacher in those areas, especially since he's saying, you want to fight for workers and the poor? Let's have a movement. We're going to have a paper, and let's have houses of hospitality like they had in the Middle Ages to help the poor and travelers. Let's have roundtable discussions where we clarify thought about issues of the day. And we'll have farms where we'll farm by day and read poetry at night and make music together. And it's very idealized, but for her, it's like, people seen the movie Jerry Maguire? It's kind of like, you had me at newspaper. That's what she's in New York to do. And so she hears all this and says, oh, this is all interesting, but hey, let's do the newspaper. And so she gradually gets pulled into Peter's thinking and does all these things. I mean, she was never really sure about the farms, and we know, you know lots of farmers around here. I mean, it's not easy work, right? It's very idealized. But she says, let's give this a go. And I have to say about Peter, we had some kind of, not struggle, but we had to think through how to portray him. Because in some ways he's a comic figure, because he's very ridiculous about this, about just, badgering you until you say, yes, you're right, Peter. Just keep telling you. So okay, you're right. But at the same time, a visionary, and has a vision for a movement that is bigger now than it was at the time of Dorothy Day's death. Some really incredible growth. you can see, this is kind of a fun bar graph with bales of newspapers. 1933, circulation 20,000. 1938, 190,000. Catholics are excited about this new movement because this new movement is finally giving them an alternative to the crummy lives they have under this exploitative capitalist system and an alternative to communism. This is saying, let's come together, voluntary associations, promote unions and churches working together to build workers' lives better. And early ally there on the left, has anyone ever heard of the Sisters of Bethany? They were called back then reformed prostitutes. Today we would call them human trafficking survivors. But they had a deal with Dorothy where they would free women from their pimps and then hide them in Catholic worker houses. And so they contributed a lot to beds and cash. They would raise money from folks with money to help women out of prostitution, and Dorothy would keep them safe from the pimps. So that was a very important ministry in the early Catholic worker that sometimes gets lost. I'd learned about this working on her canonization. And then a very strong emphasis in the paper on the work of unions. And here's July 1937, page 1 of the Catholic Worker. And again, looking to all of these problems that we have today in 2025 around workers, this is a strike against John D. Rockefeller. And what happens to you is the Chicago police get sent to shoot you and bash you in the head. This is less than 100 years ago. Then just to kind of move forward, throughout that, she posed World War II, so that was a big deal and caused the movement to slide down a bit in participation. But then it came back, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. She goes down to Koinonia Farm in Athens, Georgia, right? Is it? No, where is it? It's in Georgia. We'll come back to you, Ann. Anyway, she gets involved with Koinonia Farm, which is an interracial farming community started by Clarence Jordan. You might have heard of his Cotton Patch Gospel, where he translates the Bible into Southern vernacular. It's really fun. And he created this movement that was actually popular with their neighbors for years and years, but when the Civil Rights Movement came, neighbors started boycotting them and also shooting at them. Dorothy volunteers for the night watch against the advice of everyone, and she makes friends with this Baptist woman, and they say, okay, we got to stay up all night. Why don't we do some stuff? Like, why don't we sing hymns? I'll teach you my Baptist hymns. So she brings her accordion, and they're singing Baptist hymns in there, and then Dorothy says, I'll teach you Liturgy of the Hours. So, because there's a monastery in Congers, Georgia, nearby, and right when the monks are doing one of the night prayers, Dorothy pulls out her breviary and shares this, I'm going to do it. Then suddenly this guy shows up in a truck and shoots at blows out the windows in the station wagon they're in. And if Dorothy and this other woman didn't duck fast enough, we'd be talking about Dorothy Day the Martyr. She ends up traveling by Greyhound bus all over the country. She goes to death row in Philadelphia. She speaks at Yale Law School. She helps people, especially young people, all over the country start Catholic worker houses. So this is one way that the movement grows. And then she ends up getting in a big fight with New York's Cardinal Spellman. An interesting thing about Dorothy, she was very loyal to her local bishops, except when they went against the teachings of Jesus and the Catholic social teaching. Then she would hold them accountable. So it wasn't like Dorothy's fighting with them to build a new kind of church that's run in a different way. She's really saying, let's have the same church, but by the way, you're on the wrong side, Cardinal Spellman, because his cemetery workers said, we would like to work 5 days a week instead of 6 days a week for the same pay. Imagine that. How greedy. That's what Cardinal Spellman thought. So he said, not only are you not going to get that, you're all a bunch of communists, so you're all fired. Now, the bodies began to pile up in coffins, and winter came along. And so Cardinal did a very interesting and something that really set Dorothy off, so she began writing about him in the newspaper, which is he had seminarians come in as scabs. So they stopped classes, and the seminarians became cemetery workers. What's that? Oh, 1949. 1949. And I had the privilege of giving this presentation with the son of one of those cemetery workers in the audience. And he said, not only was his father fired, he was denied burial in the Archdiocesan Cemetery because he was a communist. And he wasn't a communist. He was just striking against Cardinal Spellman. And he told me a story also about another guy, another worker, whose son was a seminarian. So the son crossed his father's picket line.
Probably no choice.
Well, that's how the son felt about it. So this was a very, I worked for the Archdiocese of New York for years, and this was a very, very important moment in the Archdiocese. Today, everybody says Dorothy was the right, even Cardinal Dolan would say that. So Cardinal Spellman, in some ways, was an enemy of Dorothy, but then when J. Edgar Hoover, Dorothy was on a list of people to be rounded up and put in concentration camps when phase 2, first the Japanese, then round up the usual suspects, and Dorothy was on that list. And Cardinal Spellman was asked by the FBI, what do you think about this woman? And he always said some version of, she's a pain in the butt, but she's well-intentioned. She's not a communist. And I have a friend who's an older priest, and he said, when I told him that story, he said, that's how we were trained. And I said, what do you mean? He said, that as priests, you will run into people who are a real pain in the neck and who you're really upset with and you want to discipline. But always be careful, they might be a saint. And you don't want to go too far. And some of the neat things I got to research, the Encyclopedia of Catholicism, the Encyclopedia of California Catholicism, there's a book of that, In the section on Cardinal McIntyre, who was Spellman's chancellor, it says that he was always nervous around Dorothy Day because he thought she might be a saint. He didn't like what she was doing, but he was afraid that she might be a saint. So that's a little bit about, Dorothy's relationship to the institutional church, very loyal, but holding accountable. And they didn't like that. But then there'd be another check and balance. They were trained like, be careful, might be a saint. But at the end of the day, Dorothy's holiness was really in her little acts, the little way of St. Therese. That it's not just, and I've learned this a lot from Robert Ellsberg, who studied her life inside out, edited her diaries and her letters. Robert always says, everyone wants to talk about the arrests, but her real holiness was in mopping the floors, cutting the carrots for the soup, all the little things. And that's one reason she was a devotee of St. Therese. During the 60s, she becomes a mentor for a lot of anti-war activists. And here, was the original draft card burning in Union Square. 4 men burned their draft cards. And 2 of them are Catholic workers, including Tom Cornell, who I got a chance to get to know before he died. But at the same time, she had a mixed relationship with hippies. And there are people who were alive during this time said, Dorothy loved the hippies. Well, she wrote in her diary that, she had a real problem with the drug use, the lack of help in the houses, and getting the girls pregnant. you know. That was a big concern of hers. And here, Stanley Wisniewski, who's a real interesting supporting character in The Catholic Worker, he said to her, now we've always had freeloaders at the Catholic Shirker. That's his little joke about all the people who didn't work. But Dorothy was, you know, she compared them to the Beats, and she didn't like the Beats. She was friends with Allen Ginsberg, but she didn't like the drugs and the sex and that sort of thing. Her last demonstration was with the United Farm Workers in 1973. She was arrested with Joan Baez and people like that. And this is a famous photograph that we got permission to paint from a different angle, where all the sheriff's deputies are surrounding this, you know, frail old lady, and the guns are real big and present in the foreground. And then, of course, she had a big friendship with Mother Teresa. She did not see a big difference between what they were doing. You know, today people say, you know, Mother Teresa's about charity, Dorothy Day's about justice. That's not the way they interacted. They saw it on a spiritual plane. And this is something that really happened in The Catholic Worker when Mother Teresa was there. One of the guests said, got a cigarette? And Mother Teresa says, no, I don't smoke. And she says, then what good are you? Imagine that. See, that's the harsh and dreadful love. So I'm just gonna quickly share a little bit about the sainthood process. It begins as servant of God. And we've got, this is the free item on here. We've got the prayer card for Dorothy Day, servant of God. She is an official candidate on the track to sainthood. My job for 7 years, sorry?
Is she a servant of God?
Yeah, she's servant of God right now. She's known as Dorothy Day, servant of God. And it's okay if you don't say that at the end. You know, one of my friends said, is it like Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? You know, do you have to say that every time? And I said, no, it's fine. It's just, that's her churchy title. And she got that in the year 2000. And in the year 2014, I was hired to gather the evidence. Because this isn't a project, it's not a paper, it's not a book, it's a trial. With a question not of guilt or innocence, but did she live a life of heroic virtue? And so that is what happens with the venerable stage, determining that. And my job was to coordinate the efforts of, you know, transcribing her 10,000-page diary, which had messy handwriting, her letters, which sometimes were typed and sometimes were with that messy handwriting, interviewing or taking testimony from 35 people who knew her very well, and of course getting some current bishops to reflect on her life and why she's important. And
who hired you to do that?
What's that?
Who hired you to do that?
Cardinal Dolan. Yeah, it happens in the diocese where the person died, not where they were born, but where they died. And, sorry? New York. Yeah, she died in Mary House where the Mother Teresa, where she met with Mother Teresa. She lived there during the 70s. And there's not like one Catholic worker house in New York that, you know, they were there and it's 100 years old, 90 years old Catholic worker house. They moved around, and even the house, one house got taken by eminent domain to build the 2nd Avenue subway, which still hasn't been finished. And there's a famous story, you know, Robert Ellsberg calls it an example of the saints' holy folly, you know, where it seems like they're doing something silly, but it's actually very holy. The city of New York was late in compensating the Catholic worker movement for the seizure of the house, so they gave the money plus some interest. And Dorothy wrote out a check for the amount of the interest and sent it back to the city and said, we don't believe in lending money at interest. Which is kind of, you know, an old school church, old church idea. So anyway, that's all about, did she live a life of virtue? We sent in on the anniversary of Dorothy's prayer to God to help her find a way. It was the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. So that's a very special feast for Dorothy. We sent 2020 Immaculate Conception Feast. We sent 2/3 of a ton of paper to the dicastery for the causes of saints. And that is for the venerable stage. And that's what they're now going through. It's going to be a while. It's a lot of paper. Then the miracles come in. A proven miracle, there's such a thing as a miracle trial in the Catholic Church. Proven miracles, through a miracle trial, she becomes blessed. And then a second miracle, she becomes a saint. Now, if she had died when she was shot, she would be a martyr for charity. Pope Francis would have called her. And so she'd go right to blessed. But she didn't get killed. She died at 83, surrounded by people who loved her. So these are some things I've mentioned. 2 theologians I didn't mention have to go through all her published works. Now, this is somebody who I.F. Stone, who founded The Nation magazine, he described her, he showed up at her wake, and people were saying, "You're an atheist, what are you doing here?" He said, "I came to pay tribute to one of the great journalists of the 20th century." They asked the same thing of Abby Hoffman. They said, "What are you doing here, Abby?" And he said something that I couldn't print exactly, but it was like, this is the closest this Jew boy is ever going to get to a saint. So that's what Abby said. Anyway, all of that, the testimonies of bishops, things I mentioned, but additional supportive material. Things like Time magazine had an article on living saints, which is something the Catholic Church doesn't believe in, but it's something journalists believe in. And guess who was on the cover? Mother Teresa. And on the B-level saints, Dorothy was on the interior there. And so things like that. We got an original copy of that. One of the Catholic workers had saved it. He donated it to the cause so we could send it in. Also, let's go to, where is it? Oh yeah, here we go. Additional supportive material. Who's this right here? Batman. There's a character in Batman based on her. Denny O'Neil was a young writer who was assigned an interesting job. Batman had become a joke by the 1970s. You remember that TV show? No, Batman. It's real silly. So Batman was a joke. But this is a guy who saw his parents murdered in front of him in a robbery. That is not a silly character. And the original Batman is very dark. That's why, he becomes a bat, right? And so Denny O'Neil's job was to bring Batman back to his darker roots. And he was also hanging out with the Catholic worker. And gradually, he became a pacifist after encountering Dorothy and listening to her talk. And so he's becoming a pacifist, and he's writing a very violent comic book. And so he's having this cognitive dissonance, and what am I going to do? Do you quit and go back to St. Louis? This is he's in his 20s, and he's writing Batman. So he compromises. He introduces a character named Dr. Leslie Tompkins, who took care of the young Bruce Wayne after his parents were murdered. She knows his secret identity, and she becomes the conscience of Batman. So she's always telling him, you need to work out these problems without violence. And he beat up the crooks or the supervillains or whatever. And he uses her in that way. And even after Danny O'Neil stopped doing that, moved on to other things, some of the other writers did interesting things. In the 90s, she threatened to report Bruce Wayne to Child Protective Services for getting Robin in so much trouble. You mean dragging this little kid along with him in these violent situations? I mean, what kind of person does that, right? So that's how they were able to bring that pacifist voice and kind of a moral voice to Batman. So, and this is all documented. Denny O'Neil did a lot of interviews before he died when he talked about it, and he was very disappointed that that pacifist voice has been diminished in that character over the years. I haven't really been reading Batman lately, so I couldn't tell you what they're doing with her now. But I did hear she was included in the Gotham TV series. So if you ever get a chance to watch that on streaming. Another thing, and we mentioned this right at the beginning, there's Joan Collins, right, playing Edith Keeler in classic Star Trek, in an episode called The City on the Edge of Forever. And this is the one where the Enterprise goes through a space-time anomaly and ends up circling the Earth, and the team, the usual team, beams down to the Earth, and they look around and like, the Nazis are running everything. I think, what is this? And so Mr. Spock developed some kind of contraption where you can actually watch like a video of what happened in history, and he's looking at it and sees that this woman, Edith Keeler, started a pacifist movement that successfully kept the U.S. out of World War II long enough that the Nazis win. So in a sense, it's a critique of Dorothy Day. And if you watch the episode, you see like there's this soup kitchen that she runs, and the lettering on the soup kitchen is exactly like the Catholic worker lettering and all this. It's less documented, like Gene Roddenberry didn't say, oh, I based this on Dorothy Day. But the circumstantial evidence really points to this. And you can see it on things like Wikipedia and elsewhere on the internet that they mention, it's not proven, but the circumstantial evidence is pretty strong. Captain Kirk falls in love with her, but then they have to kill her, or they have to let her be killed so that the U.S. can save the world. But the fact that they chose Dorothy Day as the model is an homage to her, but it's a just war doctrine critique of her. So it's kind of an interesting situation. But I'm sure she would be happy that Joan Collins played her. Just a few quick other things. Another impact, Dorothy Day was a big fan of worker-owned businesses. There was this philosophy that has many names, but at the time Dorothy was into it in the 50s. It was called distributism. And it was an interesting third way. It was like saying, capitalism is really good at creating wealth. Maybe a small amount of people shouldn't have all that wealth. Maybe the people who do all the work should have more of it. And so things like worker-owned businesses became a real interest of hers as one way. And the church has, through the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, has supported many worker-owned businesses. It's one way your contribution to CCHD goes to work. I just want to finish with a little piece on heroic virtue, because this is all, did she live a life of heroic virtue? And by that mean, faith, hope, love, the theological virtues, and the cardinal virtues, justice, temperance, fortitude, etc. Did she live them heroically? And you can go down that list of all those virtues and ask that question, because that's what's happening at the Vatican right now. For me, came down to the story that is, part of it is well known, which is that Foster, he's aged a little bit just like her, calls her up and says, my partner Nanette, this is the woman that he fell in love with after Dorothy. My partner Nanette is dying of cancer. And he still didn't believe in marriage. They'd been together 25 years at that point. I hear you take care of people. Would you take care of Nanette? And Dorothy says yes. They fly up from Florida, where they live, and rent a cabin in Staten Island, right next to Dorothy's. And Dorothy brings back all those nursing skills she learned during that other pandemic and takes care of Nanette. Nanette asked to be baptized a day or two before she dies. It's interesting, these atheists, how much they think about God, She's an atheist, she asked to be baptized. Dorothy baptizes her. You probably know that we can in extraordinary situations. You think of battlefield, situations and all. Lay people can baptize. And so Dorothy baptizes her, Nanette dies. I think of that as heroic virtue. I think of I have a few exes, if one of them called me and asked me to take care of their partner, I don't know if I would immediately say yes, like Dorothy did. And I think of some of my exes would definitely say no immediately to me if I asked that. Would you take care of my wife? She's dying. So Dorothy does this, and this is the part that not everybody knows. I don't even know if Anne knows this. this nun that Dorothy got sick once when she was traveling, and this nun that was hosting her said, "Stay with me and recover." And Dorothy had a lot of heart problems and just generally was not in great health in her senior years, and it took her months to recover. And so after a while, they got to, talking about a lot of things, and Dorothy told her a story. Now, we don't have a second verification of this, but it seemed like the nun called us up and told us this story, that everything I just told you was part of that story. But then she said, about an hour later, after Nanette died, Forster turns to me and says, "Do you think we could ever get back together?" And Dorothy told her, "It only took me a second to say no, but it was the longest second of my life." I think, what a writer, right? That is so beautiful and so painful at the same time, and so infuriating as well. Just thinking of, he's still in love with her, but, the timing's off, So anyway, I would like to just hit the pause button now and just ask if there's questions, comments, corrections, Anne. Corrections. Yes, sir. And we're going to try to get the microphone around so we can hear.
Is the Catholic worker, is the Catholic worker still being published?
Yes, it is. And once you get on their mailing list, you will not get off no matter how hard you try. Like, I never tried, but I moved and I never told them, and then it keeps showing up, like it followed me. So they're very good at keeping the subscribers involved. It's only 1 cent, so I just try to, when I remember, send a donation once a year.
No, that's what I wanted to say, because I've been getting it for years, and it still says 1 cent at the top of the paper, and you have to remember to...
Yeah, it's symbolic. Yeah.
Symbolic. Was Dorothy raised with any religion? Was her original family?
Oh, that's a great question. She was baptized Episcopalian. So she was baptized. She was actually rebaptized. This would never happen today. It would be like you're being received into full communion of the church. But back then they still did that. Yeah, and there is a little C chancery on her. There's a little, there's a column on the baptism register that says other or something like that. It says C chancery. We think that might have had something to do with the abortion, that, just to make sure that she completed the sacrament of reconciliation. And people often ask, does that disqualify her for sainthood? And it's actually, I don't have a spiritual answer, I have a legalistic answer. It all happened before she became Catholic, so that doesn't count against her. If she had been Catholic, she would not be at this point.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because of the abortion, and then she had a child out of wedlock besides,
Before she became Catholic.
Right. Okay, so that...
Yeah.
Okay,
you know who else had a child out of wedlock? St. Augustine.
Right. No, I'm sure there's lots, but...
It's like that whole story, they say about the saints of very holy people, but they sure had a good time before their conversion, especially the men, right? Good point.
I'm just wondering, Jeff, if you know of any miracles Dorothy
Oh, yeah, great
actually
question.
participated in or caused,
Yeah,
maybe many.
And I should ask you all, make sure you pick up, this is actually free, so you have to pay for the book, but you get this for free. But there's the official prayer that Cardinal Dolan composed, and one of the things you do with this prayer is you ask for her intercession for some need you have. And what we ask people to do is tell us about the graces and favors you've received. So that, that's the normal stuff. That's not a miracle that we get. We pray for some kind of healing in a relationship or for some need of yourself that's not at the miracle level. But what happens when people report us their graces and favors, some things come up that you think, is that a miracle? We should really check that out. And sometimes people say, here's a miracle for you. You know, one that happened, I think I was talking to somebody earlier about, somebody called and said, I had a tumor in my arm, and it showed up in an x-ray at my doctor's office, so I was going into the biopsy the next day, but I prayed, or the next week, and I prayed to Dorothy Day that the tumor would go away, and when I got there for the biopsy, they couldn't find it.
That's exciting.
Then they said, I also prayed to Sister Thea Bowman. Is that a problem? I said, yes, it's a problem. Think about it as in a miracle trial. You have to prove that there's no explanation other than Dorothy Day's intercession. So you could say a miracle happened here, but it could have been Thea Bowman. You know, and that's the thing. And you think of yourself as a person of faith, and you know, you're going to do your chemo, you're going to take that Whole Foods diet that somebody you saw on the Instagram is talking about. You're going to pray to Dorothy Day, and maybe you're going to pray to 3 other people. You know, you're going to try everything, and that's often what happens. But that's what happened in that case. We also got, I prayed to find a free parking space in Manhattan, and I did. Now, when I present in New York City, people go like, yeah, that's it. You know, everywhere else they laugh. But yeah, we had another hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
I have heard, and I think I read it someplace, that she would not want to be known as a saint.
Yeah.
Do you get that? Does that make any sense
all
to you?
the time, yeah. There's a truth to that in the sense of her humility. Like when that Living Saint article was done, Robert Ellsberg tells a story of, you know, he was trying to get Dorothy to do the interview. You know, so he was like, oh, there's this woman from Time Magazine that wants to talk with you. And she said, oh yeah, I've been avoiding her all day. You know, like she was not interested in being put on a pedestal. And she also was shrewd enough to know that people would say, oh, Dorothy Day, you're so wonderful. I could never do what you do. She wanted people to do what she was doing. So she did not want to be put on a pedestal. It's really about how we might use her canonization. Is it to get us off the hook, or is it to inspire us to do that? Now, you may have heard that quote, don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed that easily. This is after the Living Saint article came out. A journalist came up to her and said, how does it feel to be a living saint? You know? And, you know, instead of cursing at him, she said, don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed that easily. And I've heard that that's now her most famous quote. So the lesson for that is, be careful how sarcastic you are, because it might be the thing that you're remembered for, you know? So yeah, and there are people, particularly in her movement, that say she shouldn't be a saint, and they range in reasons. Sometimes it's the church doesn't deserve her, sometimes it's she didn't want to be a saint, and one thing we have to think of, and back to things Robert Ellsberg said, we need to understand sainthood's not a Catholic Hall of Fame. It's there to be examples of Christian living for us and people we can turn to in prayer. And Dorothy Day is that person, I believe, and a lot of people believe. But there are people who oppose her canonization. But there are far more people who oppose her canonization who are fans of her than are people who, she was a communist. And you know, Cardinal Dolan, he got that at a conference. He said, well, you know, she was really more of an anarchist. And people just laughed. They didn't really get it, you know. But he's a historian, so these distinctions are important to him. But yes, sir.
Who makes the final decision as to someone to become a saint? Is it the Pope or committee, or
Yeah,
how did that work?
It's a lot like who makes the final decision about who's going to be your next bishop. It's they call them dicasteries now. Yeah, it's a committee. Dicastery is a fancy word for department. So the Department of Saints will make a recommendation based on going through all those questions about did she live a life of heroic virtue, all of the reports of the theologians who read everything she ever published. That's a lot of stuff. No smoking guns. Like, I kind of went into it. My daughter, Julie, said, Dad, if you found something bad about Dorothy Day, would you bring it up or would you try to cover it up, so she'd be a saint? I said, Julie, we took an oath. Like, we're there to find the truth. We're not there to promote a particular person. I mean, I knew enough about Dorothy to be somewhat of a fan, but, there are these things like, Dorothy was very good to priests in trouble, particularly alcoholic priests who needed to dry out or whatever, or had kind of lost their way in some way. Now, were any of those guys sex abusers? I betcha. And so one of the things I was curious about was, did Dorothy run into any of these situations, and did she cover them up? Nothing about that. Nothing about that. Some of those guys might have been scoundrels, but so were a lot of guests at the Catholic Worker.
Now, you lost me. You said make a recommendation. Make a recommendation to who?
To the Holy Father.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he makes the saints in the end. And remember, he made Pope John the 23rd a saint without all of the process. So he has the right to circumvent the process. And actually, Cardinal Dolan, I mean, this wasn't our recommendation, but when he came to New York, Cardinal Dolan was like, you know what? Holy Father, why don't you just make her a saint today in Madison Square Garden, And I was like, oh, it'll be interesting to see how he gets out of this. And so the Pope goes to his people, and then he comes back and says, well, you haven't finished the process yet. You haven't done anything yet. And so that's when I knew my job was secure, because he committed to doing it. And Cardinal Dolan really is the right cardinal to move this along. Like, he has such a sense of the politics of it. Like, we sent all this evidence to the Holy See. 6 months later, we got a bill for them receiving the boxes. And I'm like, okay, all right, okay. So we, put in, 20,000 euros. Yeah, here you go. And 6 months after that, we got a bill for them opening the boxes. What? Yeah. For real. Opening the boxes. And then, what's that?
Did you know what the cost would be before?
Well, it's somewhat mysterious. Yeah, it is somewhat mysterious. There's things we knew what the costs would be. Like, when people give testimony, we have to pay a court reporter. Like, that's not just like, oh, we get a nice person who knows how to type. You got to get a court reporter who does, like, annulment cases. Like somebody that not the Chancery, the judiciary. What's it called? Yeah, but there's a word for it in the what is it? Where the annulments happen. God, I'm sorry, I'm spacing out. Yeah, judicial vicar. Yeah, in the judicial vicar's office, they have people that they trust who do confidential work. A court reporter. We got to pay her at the prevailing rate. So you think about you hear like canonization. It costs too much money. It's not that you bring a bag of money to the Vatican as like a kind of bribe or something, and they make you're the founder of the religious order in your hometown a saint. And there is a bit of sainthood industrial complex around founders of religious orders, where like every order wants to have their founder canonized. There's good money in that for the canon lawyers that are involved. But we had all those things done, and we've got all the evidence there, and they started sending us these bills, and then nothing happened for 2 years after that. It's just silence. You wonder, well, what's going on there? And so we asked Cardinal Dolan, like, you got to do something. Like, they're just sitting on this stuff. And so he is thinking, he says, I'll write a letter to the Holy Father. So he writes this letter, Holy Father, it's Dorothy Day's 125th birthday. Would you give her a birthday present of assigning staff to her case for cause for canonization? Pope does it. There's people working on it now, and they tell us they could finish in a year or two. So, people always ask me, well, how long is it going to take? I say between 300 and 300 years. We don't know, and we don't know when these miracles are going to come. But we do know that there's a very specific process to venerable, and that should be 1 to 2 years. Yeah. Yes?
I am really interested in this idea of what maybe could be lost or maybe smoothed over in the complexity of her life if she were to become a saint. But I also am curious what you think the real benefit would be to the church or Catholics or other people who might already, look up to her in a lot of ways. And what do you think sainthood might bring that, we don't already kind of have around her?
I think back to our first 2 things we started with, nonviolence as a viable option. She anticipated a lot of the teaching on Vatican II and Pacem in Terris in her own commitment to nonviolence. So that's something, and I speak as somebody who's like a strict just war guy. Like, I've been to Rwanda, I get it, there are times when the use of force is necessary, but I am very inspired and become more strict for myself because of Dorothy Day. So I think that kind of commitment to peace is one, and also a commitment to people who are suffering. You think of today's gospel. Imagine a homily where a priest or a deacon could point to Dorothy Day as an example. This is how you do it. This is how you do it. It isn't easy, but you can do it. G.K. Chesterton once said, it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's that Christianity has been found difficult and left untried. Well, here's somebody who tried. For me, that's the best thing that we could say. Here's somebody who tried. Somebody like you, somebody, think of young adults who were searching for something. Young adults who stay up late, having a couple of beers with friends and talking about building a better world. Well, this is how you can do it. That often gets described as her bohemian lifestyle, but it's kind of the way a lot of young adults live. Anne.
I'd just like to add one point. I agree fully with what Jeff has said, but what is important for me, having studied her spirituality, is how eclectic it is. And I feel that eclectic spirituality, which draws from veneration of saints, which draws from Vatican II, which draws from so many sources that this would take many, many lifetimes to study her spirituality in depth, that this is potentially a unifying factor among today's Catholics who are so divided in what we think we believe and what we think other people ought to be believing as Catholics. So, and in what we do too. So, I think that that's very important.
Isn't there a movie out on her somewhere? Seems to me I saw a documentary somewhere.
There are movies. I prefer an older movie. I don't know about you, Jeff, but there's one that was done in 2009. And I'm trying to think of who the person. Claudia Larson. Claudia Larson's film, Don't Call Me a Saint, which I think you can purchase and watch it on YouTube or whatever. That one is good because a lot of the people who are speaking about Dorothy are those Catholic workers from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, people who knew her over a very long period of time. The film that was done by Martin Doblmeier a few years ago, I don't like, and it's primarily because he's using celebrities. Martin Sheen, well, he knew her a little bit, but, Sister Joan Chittister, I don't think she ever met Dorothy Day. She's a popular figure, but I'd rather, as a historian anyhow, I'd rather have the people who really knew her rather than celebrity talking heads. And then years ago, there was a film that was made by a priest that was fictionalized, and Martin Sheen played Peter Moore. And boy, if there's ever a really awful casting, it was Martin Sheen as Peter Moore. And Peter was a person who was not neat and tidy. He didn't have nicely combed hair. Dorothy herself even wrote that, you know, bathing was not his big thing. And so, and the film just has so many historical inaccuracies, like nuns being an example for what Dorothy did. Well, yeah, I don't think that that's...
Yeah, it seemed like there was some sort of special, you know, maybe...
Yeah, I think you're thinking of the Martin Doblmeier film, which Martin Doblmeier's a friend. Ever since I watched his Bonhoeffer movie, I got hooked on his stuff. I think it might be best watched with his other, they're now boxing it as prophets, and they have like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day. That's kind of an interesting way of doing it, but I think you're right that those older ones, and there is a fragment too that George Horton's wife was gonna do a movie, and she had some interviews with some of those older folks that are neat to watch. If you ever get a chance to go to Marquette, we'll finish up with this because I know we still have some goodies to eat. Oh, we'll do one more. But if you ever get a chance, the Marquette University Dorothy Day archives are her official archives. And they do have videos there that, you know, like, I guess with YouTube, you can see a lot of these. There's one from Irish television with this interviewer, Irish television personality interviewing Dorothy Day. That's really sweet. And you can also listen to Mike Wallace interview Dorothy for some, not 60 minutes, but another show. And he's really a hostile interviewer. So it's really interesting just saying, like, well, you know, the Bible says, you know, and she's just really calm throughout it. But yes, we had one more.
You mentioned Dorothy's daughter. Does she have any other descendants?
Yeah, it was interesting because Dorothy had one child who had, was it 8 or 9 children? 9, who had 9 children. So she was a great, you know, I'm still waiting for my first grandchild here. You know, I've got 2 young adult daughters, and I don't know if I'm going to be waiting forever. Dorothy got 9 out of 1 kid. So Dorothy was an amazing grandmother, and there's some wonderful pictures of her with her grandchildren. They remember Granny so fondly. You know, when one of her grandchildren went to Vietnam, she was really supportive of him, even though she was very oppositional to the war. So she was a wonderful grandmother. You know, there is, you know, one of the weirder arguments against her canonization is the bad mom argument, which is that she was running around the country while, you know, who was taking care of her daughter? Well, Dorothy was a great judge of character. You know, we know nothing bad happened to Tamar, and she loved her cool Catholic worker babysitters, and so, you know, everything was fine there. And she talked about, well, you know, her mother was a very public person, so it's like listening to Roseanne Cash talking about Johnny Cash, you know, like he was a public person. She is known as being a really good grandmother, and I was listening to a Terry Gross interview with the historian Jill Lepore. And she did a history, The Secret History of Wonder Woman, which is a fantastic book, because it gets, like, you know, like Anne knows, you know, the best historical books are ones that introduce you to a period, introduce you to many things about it. And she was talking about, Jill Lepore was talking about when she was reading women's magazines from the 1920s. And they had things like how to balance career and family, and things like that. And one of the things she said, because she went into that whole story of Olive Byrne and the hunger strike and Planned Parenthood and all that. And she said, well, you know, the interesting thing about, you know, Margaret Sanger and Dorothy Day and many other public women of that time was it was arguable about whether they were really good parents, but they were amazing grandparents. And I think Dorothy might have been in that category because she was such a public person.
she wasn't there at every minute of her daughter's life. But on the other hand, her daughter remembers it very well, and that she was well taken care of. So that's a great question. A lot of people ask about Tamar. I'm sorry I didn't talk more about it. Yeah, we've got 2 granddaughters who are very public people. I like to say that the genes landed on Kate as the writer and Martha as the activist. Martha does do some writing, but Kate had a career as a travel writer. Is that right? She's a travel writer. And then she wrote this memoir. She'd always wanted to write a book about her mother. And her publisher said, it's got to be a book about Dorothy. No one's going to buy a book about your mother. But if it's a book about Dorothy and Tamar, that's something people are going to buy. So she wrote this book, which I was telling friends that I thought it was going to be like, I Remember Granny, you know, but it's very hard-hitting and shares a lot of things that the world didn't know about the family. And actually, in some ways, got people in the family talking about some hurts that they hadn't talked about in a long time. So, you know, both ways. It's a thing. You hang out with writers, they're going to tell stories. So thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful.